Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these heterodox conversations for complexity. Happy New Year, and thanks again for tuning in. A couple quick housekeeping notes. Just before the new year rang in, we did officially launch our Thought Stretchers education community. This is an extension of our usual professional development work, which has always been and will remain at wegrowteachers.com. And now the Thought Stretchers education community is at thoughtstretchers.org. There you'll find the landing page, our guiding principles, what to expect inside, but you'll have to register to get an account to interact and see the communications and interactions between members. If you're interested in having education-specific and non-toxic conversations for complexity, please consider going to thoughtstretchers.org and signing up and joining our community. As always, please reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org with any questions.
Americans on opposite sides of the political spectrum don't just disagree on the issues. More and more, they can't stand one another. This partisan animosity is the crisis of our time and threatens our nation. Braver Angels is here to address this. Our mission is to bring Americans together to bridge the partisan divide and strengthen our democratic republic. But no single organization, no matter how successful, can be powerful enough all on its own to heal this divide. If our goal is really to strengthen our democratic republic, our only practical strategy is to ignite and shape a broader movement for civic renewal. That's why we started Braver Network. At Braver Network, you'll find organizations from all across the country and all across the political spectrum that even when they disagree on the issues, come together to spark this movement for civic renewal. In building this network, we commit to equal representation, not just between conservatives and liberals, independents and nonpartisan groups, but also between national and community-level organizations. At Braver Network, you'll find the whole gamut, from businesses and leadership organizations to educational and religious institutions, all committed to improving our politics and strengthening our nation. We're looking for leaders and members of all kinds of organizations who are ready to lead and take part in the movement. Joining is completely free, and the opportunities for collaboration are endless. Help turn the tides of toxic polarization. Check out braverangels.org to sign your organization up for Braver Network.
In this episode, I spoke with Peter Gray, who is a research professor at Boston College in psychology and neuroscience. I was introduced to Peter by Lenore Skenazy, who you might remember from previous episodes. She wrote a book named Free Range Kids and is co-founder with Peter and Jonathan Haidt of Let Grow, which is an organization designed to foster independence and free play and unstructured activities for kids for better development. So we talked about some of the intersections there and the history behind his work leading to that. He talked about the difference in education and school and some of the outcomes that he values, which are certainly different from some of the values and outcomes that other folks might say are more important. We talked about a culture of achievement, which is certainly related to that, versus what I would call a culture of teaching and learning. The effects of the TV and introduction of television and A Nation at Risk in the 80s, of how that affected things. And then we ended our conversation talking more about an article and his thoughts about self-directed education, the nature of educational outcomes and direct and explicit instruction, some of the criticisms and pushback, and I tried to introduce some devil's advocacy and criticisms and got his reaction on that. So, as always, I hope this conversation with Peter is helpful, and without further ado, here it is. All right, I'm here with Peter Gray. Peter, I think, best described as a research professor, not teaching anymore, I don't think, right? But
That's correct.
He's going to give us an introduction of who he is and some of the background, that kind of thing, so folks know who they're listening to. So, Peter, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm a research professor of psychology and neuroscience in Boston College. I am retired from teaching, but continue to conduct research, write academic articles, and most of my research in recent times, recent being actually the last several decades, is has to do with children's play and how children learn naturally and what childhood is all about. And I've been very concerned as a citizen with the ways in which we are depriving children of a normal childhood in recent times. And so much of my writing for the popular press is about that.
Okay. Well, I came upon you more specifically from my connection with Lenore Skenazy, who, of course, is, I think, one of the co-founders of Let Grow, as you are, right? I think I don't know if you're technically a co-founder or what your exact role is there, but Jonathan Haidt being in the mix there. And Lenore's been on a couple times, and one of the things that I really value about her work and try to help folks better understand is the value of doing the things that promote independence in kids. Certainly, that is a growing challenge, and I've talked with Lenore about that is important, and some of the ways in which some of the things we can do to achieve that. So yeah, I'm curious, maybe you said recently as in decades, how did you get started, and some of the sort of life story thing, maybe some of the previous decades before the recent decades, and how it developed into where you are at this point?
Yes. Well, I started off really as a neuroscientist doing research on the brains of rats and mice and the binding of certain hormones in the brain, kind of looking at basic neural mechanisms. But I had a son who was rebelling in school and rebelling to such a point that we ended up having to find an alternative to school for him. And we found a very radically alternative school. I describe this in the first chapter of my book entitled Free to Learn. We found a radically alternative school which is so much different from typical schools. And he was very happy there, but I began to be a little concerned, as most parents would be, about what his future would be, if he continued with that school all the way through what would be called high school someplace else. And so I ended up, as a concerned father largely, but also with some academic interest, doing a study of the graduates of that school at that time to see how they were doing in the world after going to such an unusual school. And I found they were doing very well.
Okay.
And then, when you look at what kids are doing at that school, you would say, well, they're just playing. They're just, quote, just playing. They're doing what you would think kids would be doing when they're free to do what they want to do. They're just playing. They're hanging out. They're talking with one another. They're doing... And yet they're going on to successful lives. And so then, of course, that stirred my interest. Well, what's really happening when they are, quote, just playing? And how are they becoming educated? And it really led me to kind of re-examine, well, what does education really mean? We use this word as synonyms for school, but here's kids who aren't doing anything that looks like school. It's called a school, but it doesn't look like school. And yet they're clearly becoming educated if we define education the way I now define it, which is everything that you learn that enables you to live a satisfying and meaningful life. They were living satisfying, meaningful, productive lives, and then have to include, but by my definition of education, they're well educated. So how did they become educated? And then this really led me on to a decades-long course of research having to do with education from a very kind of radical, meaning fundamental position. What really is education when we really want to come down to it? And I'm also an evolutionary psychologist. I come from a biological background. I look at human behavior from an evolutionary perspective. And from an evolutionary perspective, what over the course of natural selection, how did children become educated throughout most of human history before we had schools? And what are the basic instincts that led children to become educated? And how might those basic instincts be playing themselves out in our culture today in a setting like this particular alternative school that I was looking at? Since then, I've conducted research on with other young people who are not going to a typical school, but who are really in charge of their own education with very similar findings. So that's a quick story on how I got started and how I got interested in what children can do when they really have the freedom to do what they want to do, what they naturally want to do.
And then how did you, I guess, evolve or the pieces with like let grow and that independence of play, which if you listen to Lenore, and I think a lot of this resonates with me, that the lack of free play and unstructured time for kids and, certainly the devices, parenting being a part of that, like that has in some ways and maybe in lots of ways had a sort of negative effect on our children's development. So how did you develop into that line of work?
So at the same time that I was doing this research and developing a greater understanding and contributing to our understanding of what really play is for children and how children develop socially, emotionally, intellectually through play, as well as physically, I was also recognizing that over the course of my lifetime, and I'll give you a hint how old I am, I was a kid in the 1950s, and over the course of my lifetime, we have undergone a huge change in the way we treat children. So in the 1950s, when I was a kid, and I was not the only kid, I was outdoors playing most of the time. I was outdoors playing more than I was in school, even during the school year. Kids would be outdoors everywhere. Parents would send their kids outdoors, get out of the house.
Right.
This was in northern Minnesota. All right, so it's 0 degrees, but you just bundle up and get out of the house.
Right.
I might be exaggerating a little bit, but I remember at least a few instances where it was like that.
Sure.
So, but this was true everywhere, and there were a lot of kids. Of course, I have to admit that's part of it. There were more kids than per adult at that time. But we didn't have adult-directed sports. Little League had begun, but it wasn't very common. And so we played our own games. We made up our own games. We did a lot of. Our family moved around a lot, so in different places we lived, the kids were into different kinds of things, and I would figure out what it is the kids do there, and I'd get involved in it. So over time. And I there are now there are a couple of books on the history of play in America, which document what I have observed in my own life. That really, from about the mid-1950s on, there has been a continuous takeover of children's lives by adults. So Howard Chudikoff, who wrote a book on the history of childhood and play in America, described the first half of the 20th century as the golden era of children's play in America, because by the beginning of the 20th century, we'd pretty much eliminated child labor, at least intensive child labor. And we had school, but school was by no means the big thing that it has become over time. And so kids had a lot of free time. And also the early part of the 20th century was a time of kind of romanticization of childhood, the belief childhood should be a happy time, and so on. And so there was a lot of support for children's freedom. We didn't have the fears that people have today, even though the dangers were just as much. So children had a lot of freedom. Beginning around the middle of the 1950s, according to Chudikoff, I might put it a little bit later than that, you found less and less kids out playing. Part of it, as Chudikov points out, was television. Television was an isolating factor. And I still remember, we got our first television in 1955, which happens to be the date that Chudikov says was the turning point. That, and I think even Chudikov mentions this, but I remember it very well. One of the programs was the Mickey Mouse Club, Disney's Mickey Mouse Club, and instead of hanging out after school and playing, people would go home to watch the Mickey Mouse Club. Well, that puts you into separate houses. You're not playing now. You're doing this more passive thing of watching television. So that according to Chudikov, started it, and I think he's got a good point there. But then over time, other things began to happen. People began to think that it would be good to have, instead of kids just going out and making up their own game, wouldn't it be nice if we had adults who really know how to play the games, be coaches and teach them how to play baseball or hockey or football, whatever the sport is. And so we began the era of adult-directed sports, and they began to come into some prominence in the 1960s, have grown ever since. And now adults put their kids into these adult-directed sports rather than just send them out to play. Somehow they think this is going to be better for them, safer for them, and so on and so forth. I have reasons to say that none of that is true, but that's what people have come to believe. And so that's a factor. And really accelerating around the beginning of the 1980s, we began to develop the kind of fears that Lenore Skenazy talks about. That is really the crux of her thesis, which it was actually in 1979 and 1981, there were two cases of young boys kidnapped on the street and murdered. And the press made a big deal out of it. And the parents of one of the boys made a big deal out of it. And everybody heard about these two terrible cases. Now, these were just two cases out of millions and millions of kids who are out there playing, but two cases of this. And precisely because this is so rare, it was big news. But because it was big news and everybody heard about it, people began to think, well, this is something to be really frightened of. Right. We have to really protect our children from this. And you began to see milk cartons on your breakfast table with missing children on the milk carton. And so you were reminded, this could be my child missing. And turned out most of those missing children were runaways, but we didn't know that, that they weren't kids who were snatched on the street. This is an extraordinarily rare event that this occurs. And if they are snatched on the street, it's almost always a relative who's taken them away because they think the parents are unfit to be parents, or it's an ex-spouse who thinks that they should have custody of the child and they're just going to take the child. So this very rare occurrence frightened everybody, and a big deal was made out of it, and that really changed parents' attitudes. Whereas previously, you were a good parent if you sent your kid out, and there was the parenting magazines would recommend, if your child isn't walking to school for kindergarten, you need to do something to make sure your child help your child overcome that fear so your child can walk to school. That your child should be doing these independent things. That was the message. And then the message began to change. Then it began, and gradually it changed to essentially, not saying it exactly in these terms, but essentially implying, if you allow your child outside of your sight and outside of the sight of some person, some adult who's going to be watching your child all the time, that's negligent parenting. And as Lenore talks about, and I've heard many cases of directly from people emailing me, there are cases of parents doing what all parents used to do, send their kids out to play in the park, and then have Child Protective Services threaten taking the child away. So these are changes that have occurred over time. I became aware of these changes, and I also then because of what I know about the value of play and independent activity, based on my and others' research, I occurred. So, what's the psychological effect of all of this on children? And and then I looked into other people's research and found that there are people who've documented the rise of anxiety, the rise of depression over time in young people, and it has paralleled the rise in overprotectiveness. The more we're overprotecting children, the less we're letting them have adventures, the less we're allowing them to develop the kind of courage that you could only develop by independent activity. The more depressed they are, the more anxious they are, and the higher the suicide rate. The suicide rate among young people today is about 8 or 9 times what it was in the 1950s, and it's been, with some ups and downs, largely a linear increase ever since then. And so I put all these things together. Children need play. Play makes them immediately happy, but it also, play and independent activity allows them to develop the kinds of internal characteristics that make them resilient, that give them courage, that make them not afraid of life. And we're depriving children of that, and lo and behold, we find they're unhappy at record rates. There's huge, something like 30% of high school age children today have contemplated suicide. This is not normal. This is something really, really wrong with our society. And so I got to know Lenore. My book, Free to Learn, was published a couple of years after hers, and I was aware of her book when I had read it. And I thought, so she and we come from different backgrounds. We're talking about somewhat different messages, but we're on the same wavelength here. And I made a point of getting to know her. I actually invited her. I had organized an academic conference on play and the value of play, and but I invited her as a kind of featured speaker to it because she's also very humorous, very funny, and this would be also a way of bringing some of the people in the community of Binghamton, which is where we held the conference, to a session of our conference. And so that was the first time I met her in person, and we've been, in some senses, collaborating ever since, including the founding of the organization Let Grow.
Right. Yeah, and Lenore's book, for those who are not familiar with it, I think it's called Free Range Kids.
Correct.
And I think I came across that book and read it, I think, and then reached out to her because it resonated quite a bit with me. I have 2 daughters, 14 and 16, and certainly in the spectrum of emotional health and independence, they are not near the bottom in any respect, but certainly not where I would want them to be, at least especially when I was starting that. And Lenore gave me some ideas and some tips and things to do, and they have been very effective. And it really, to hear you talk, I hadn't thought about the 50s and even really considered. It's interesting to hear you say that there was a shift in kids, or less kids playing outside even that far back. And it makes sense if TV was introduced, that they, as you sort of discuss that dynamic, and the devices, of course, now being even more powerful in that. I know Jonathan Haidt and some others are really banging the drum about social media, and I certainly think that that's a really important piece in the ways that they talk about, but perhaps more important is the opportunity cost of the time that people, not just kids, but people, spend on screens and devices, because when you're doing that, you're not doing something else. And, my 14-year-old is, one of her defaults is to go to her bed and stare at her screen. And that's a really hard habit to break. And I see not just kids doing it, but, adults, elderly people. I talk to people, oh yeah, my parents, I mean, they just sit and scroll, and it's like, they're 50, 60, 70, 80 years old. So it's not just a phenomenon of kids. It is certainly widespread, and I don't know how we get out of it, because it's such an alluring kind of dopamine hit.
Well, we want to blame social media. I don't think that's the biggest problem. The biggest problem by far is that we are really not allowing kids to get together outside of social media. So how can we blame them for getting together on social media? It's the only way they can get together. There was a woman, Dana Boyd, who wrote a wonderful book on why kids are on social media so much. She interviewed teenagers across the country. This was part of her doctoral dissertation, then wrote a book on it. And kid after kid would say, yeah, I'd love to get together with my friends in reality. But either I or my friend is not allowed to. We're not allowed to hang out. My son in the 1970s, at that time, you'd find teenagers hanging out at shopping malls, this would be their way of getting together. Teenagers especially teenagers, need to get away from adults to communicate with one another, and the way teenagers need to communicate with one another. That's just part of growing up. And we are not providing them the opportunity to do that. So they do it on social media. That's what Dana Boyd found. That's why they're on it. That's the primary reason they're on it so much. They're also doing other things. And video games, I think, are in some sense a saving grace. It's the only way you can really play now. You're not allowed to just go out and play in the park with your friends. So if you can play video games, there's actually a lot of research on the value of video games. Video games promotes creativity. That most of the games are social. You're learning social skills playing the games. So I'm not one to blame the devices as the primary problem. I think we're blaming the devices because we don't want to blame ourselves. We don't want to blame what we have done to childhood. We don't want to blame what our schools are doing, which is atrocious. And we don't want to blame the overprotectiveness and I don't blame parents for this, but we have basically frightened parents in such a way that they just think they have to watch their kids all the time, and kids don't have the independence they used to have. And now people want to also take away social media, then they'll have no independence.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of the dynamics at play here. Your point is taken. It's the social media devices, all those things. Those are the variables in the equation, but the causal factors may be largely because of the parental supervision and structure and those kinds of things. And unfortunately, as I'm sure you well know, it takes more than one set of parents, right? Because I can say, go out and play, and there's no kids outside. So, because all the other kids are being held inside, or, it's not like they're being held hostage, but, essentially, right? It's like there's not that group that just convenes and finds each other and then figures out a game to play or whatever.
That's exactly the problem. And so it's not an easy problem that an individual parent can solve. There are things can be done. There are things that you can do, but it takes a lot of initiative on the part of parents to do it. And it's one of the reasons that Lenore and I and others of us involved with the Let Grow organization are working with schools to create opportunities for free play at school, real play before school or after school. Is one of the kinds of things we're doing. I'm also been looking at libraries as places to play. There are increasing numbers of libraries that are becoming general community centers and offering play for kids, including one of the things that a lot of libraries have now is maker spaces in them. So it's a kind of constructive play, and they attract kids and teenagers. But some libraries, not very many at this point, but it's a growing movement, are offering free play of all sorts of the library. They got loose parts, all kinds of opportunities to play both inside the library and outside the library. And then they have quiet rooms in the back of the library for people who want to use the library for more typical library purposes during those play periods. So there are things that are happening. There are people in some neighborhoods who take the initiative to get to know their neighbors who have kids, to talk to their neighbors about, wouldn't it be nice if there were certain times in the week when we all sent our kids out like old-fashioned parents did, and we told them no devices while you're outside, you've got to get out of the house, but they're all going to be out at the same time. And if there are parents who are worried about that, about the danger of that, well, let's have a parent, ideally a grandparent, in my opinion, being out there just to watch for safety, but not to intervene in how they're playing. So there are some neighborhoods that have done that. Again, it takes initiative in a world in which most people don't know their neighbors. That's one of the changes that's occurred over time that makes it difficult. But it can't. But there are things that can be done. So that's part of what we're trying to promote through the Let Grow organization.
Right. So one of the things you said, you referred to schools and what they're doing is use the word atrocious. I know you're an advocate for, at least in some settings, self-directed learning. And I'm curious to learn a little bit more about that. I don't know if when you're talking about what schools are doing is atrocious is connected to that and the educational process, or the structure and the lack of free play and removing recess and things like that. But yeah, tell me what is atrocious?
So what has happened? So first of all, let me separate two different concerns I have. So it is true that I'm an advocate of self-directed education, and I see that it works, and I've helped promote schools that are designed for self-directed education. I've conducted studies of homeschooled children who are homeschooled by the method called unschooling, where children are in charge of their own education, and the parents, instead of insisting on a curriculum, facilitate the child's own interests. I've done studies of the graduates of that, and I see they're doing very well in the world. So that's part of where I'm coming from. But I'm also coming from this. I was a public school kid in the 1950s. School then was nothing as terrible as it is now. We had in elementary school, when I was in 5th and 6th grade, I remember this well. I don't remember the earlier grades, but in 5th and 6th grade, we had 6-hour school days, which is still true today for most schools, although some schools are now longer than 6 hours. But 2 of those hours were outdoors playing. So we had half-hour recess in the middle of the morning, half-hour recess in the middle of the afternoon, a full hour at lunch. We were never expected to be in our seats more than an hour at a time. So that the understanding then was that children need play. Children are not designed to be spending hours and hours with worksheets and doing things like that. We did not have homework in elementary school at that time. Kids, once in a while a teacher would say, it'd be nice if you wrote a poem or a story at home and brought it in to share, but we did not lug worksheets and books back and forth between home and school, not in elementary school. There was some homework by the time you were in what's now called middle school, what was then called junior high school, and in high school, but not as much as today. But there was some of that then. But for kids in elementary school, you were done with school when you were done with school. And parents were not as involved with school as they are today. And so when you were out of school, you were out of school. And you had that time to be a kid, to do the things kids do, to play, to explore, to develop interests, hobbies, to have a part-time job. Even, like kids by the age of 11, I had a paper route. When I was 13, we lived in Duluth at that time. I worked for a bookbinding company after school and made some of my own money. We had time to do things besides school. And we had time to learn about the real world. We had time to find out what we like to do as opposed to what other people are making us do. But now children's lives are consumed by school and school-like activities. School has First of all, the school year is now 5 weeks longer than it was in the 1950s. It's gradually increased. The average school year is now 5 weeks. We've taken a full month out of summer and another week out of the rest of the year. We've added homework, even kindergarten children. I mean, this is, in my mind, it's child abuse to be making little kindergarten children sit in their seats and shaming them if they're not learning how to read, and sending home notes to the parents saying that their 5-year-old, some cases 4-year-old in pre-kindergarten is academically behind. This is child abuse to do this, in my opinion. And it is becoming more and more common. And what we are seeing as a result is children burning out even while they're still in kindergarten. There are reports on this. I get many emails from kindergarten teachers who are quitting because of what they're being required to do to these little children. They can see how harmful it is. So this is what has happened with our school system. And I'm expressing some emotion about this. We should be outraged about this. As a society, we should be outraged about it, but we're not. And the reason, I think, is because this has happened gradually. If this had suddenly been imposed, if back in the 1950s, somebody suddenly said, oh, we're going to start teaching reading and math to kindergarten kids. We're going to take away the play materials from kindergarten kids. We're going to cut a full month out of summer vacation. We're going to take recess away, as they have in Boston, so that the elementary schools only have 15 minutes of recess. Everybody would rebel. But it happened gradually. And so it crept up on us. And young parents today don't even know there was a time when children were free. They don't believe it's possible for children to be free.
Do you have a sense of when that gradual creep started?
It started as early as the 1960s, and it really began but it took off in the 1980s and 1990s. So there was in the early 1980s, there were a number of things that happened in the 1980s that I think really led to an acceleration of all the problems that have happened. I already talked about the 2 kids who were kidnapped and murdered. But another thing that happened in the 1980s is that there was a major book. There was a book published, sponsored by the United States government, about how bad our schools are.
A Nation at Risk.
And basically, what's that?
A Nation at Risk.
A Nation at Risk. That was the title of the book.
Yep.
A Nation at Risk. Somehow the belief was we are at risk, militarily at risk, because our children are not learning, their test scores are not as high as the East Asian kids' test scores.
Right.
So it was a ludicrous argument, but people believed it. People believed it, and that began to lead to federal government control of schools. That was the first steps towards it, where we began to have increasing federal aid to schools, but accompanying that federal aid, ultimately increased restrictions about what schools had to do, more testing, more standardized testing, more teaching to the test. And then this culminated in the No Child Left Behind Act, and then in Common Core beginning in the early 21st century, but in the 1990s with Common Core, with No Child Left Behind. All of this led to a change in the way schools operate. So prior to the 1980s, in essentially every state, teachers were in control of the classroom. Teachers decided what happens in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And most people go into teaching like kids. That's why they went into teaching. Yeah. And they get to know kids, and they can see when the kids are happy or unhappy. They adjust what they're doing to please the children to some degree, because they know that learning occurs better when the kids are happy and when they want to do what they're doing. And so teachers are smart people, and they're caring people and loving people by and large. There were always mean teachers too, and you hoped you didn't get a mean teacher, but right. Most teachers were pretty good. And so that's why schools were so bad at that time. But then, because it looked like we were getting as high test scores as some of those East Asian countries where they forced the children and what to study long hours and in this really boring drone-like way. So we thought we had to do that or we're going to fall behind them in some way. And so we began to control. So today I hear from teachers. I just had a conversation yesterday with a teacher, but it's by no means the first, who says, I'm not free. I'm no more free in the classroom than my kids are. They tell me exactly what I have to teach and how I have to teach it. And they come in and monitor once in a while. This is a middle school teacher. I've heard the same thing from kindergarten teachers, key teachers who are quitting. They say, the administration has taken the playthings out of my kindergarten because they say kindergarten isn't a place to play. So this is what teachers are facing. This is what we have done through, and the people making these policies don't know kids. They know nothing about learning. All they're looking at is test scores. And so they believe that you can measure education with these stupid test scores. And they are judging, and so now teachers are being judged by how high the test scores are for their kids. Now, we presumably did this because we believed that the East Asian countries were producing so much more intelligent people. The truth of the matter is, the East Asian, first of all, the suicide rate among East Asian kids was way higher, still is higher than it is in the United States because of the horrible schools they have. And secondly, what they've been producing in the East Asian countries is not entrepreneurs, not creative people. They've been producing, people who are good at crunching numbers and doing those kinds of things, which now we've got computers to do all that. What we need today is people who are innovative, who are creative, and you can't force that into people by making them spend all this time doing schoolwork oriented towards the least creative thing you can do, which is getting high scores on one right answer multiple choice tests, right? So what we have done is absurd, and nobody is recognizing that it's absurd. Almost nobody is.
Well, it is interesting to hear you say what you just said, because I have made a very similar hypothesis, but I haven't thought as much about the lower grades. One of the things that I've been really paying attention to and trying to work on and think about is the K-12 school, the role of K-12 in helping or hurting, sort of furthering our polarization problems. And one of the things that I have hypothesized, and I'm curious to what extent you might have any evidence, because you have certainly more resources in that realm than I do, but I have written about it and I've talked about it, ad nauseum. It feels at this point is that I say in 1983, A Nation at Risk was published, and what that did was create what I call a culture of achievement versus a culture of teaching and learning. And the things that come with a culture of achievement are some of the things that you mentioned, and the accountability, the testing, the structure, a lot of teacher burnout, test scores, and that kind of thing. And there's perhaps, I think, a Venn diagram sharing, common things of a good culture of teaching and learning, and one that honors and looks at achievement as not necessarily a bad thing, because who doesn't want their kid to achieve? But what my hypothesis is that over those decades, we have some of those things that you mentioned, the more structure and the incentive structure, and what has happened within our classrooms is a disincentivization for probably more, middle school and high school, where you would see big ideas really sort of played with and, debated or something like that. A little bit less so because it's more foundational things in elementary. Certainly you could see some of that, but not with the sophistication of thought and structure. And so what we now have are decades of students turned into adults who don't know how to have productive conversations. They don't look to seek to understand and be understood. They want to know whose side are you on? How do I prove that I'm right? How do I persuade you, to put it nicely, and that is a real problem, that we've got to get back to some sense of teaching that allows for that and sort of fosters that. It is interesting. I hadn't thought about it. It makes some intuitive sense that the lower grades you would have disincentivized and remove some of those structures of play and unstructured activity by young kids, and the sort of downstream effects on that. So I am curious if you, because I've said it's a hypothesis. I don't have the resources to research it and find evidence. I'm curious if there is evidence, or if have there been studies.
So a question of whether there have been I don't know if studies exactly directly on that question, but there's a lot that you said that I want to comment on. First of all, a culture of achievement, but how are we defining achievement, right?
Right.
So we're defining achievement very narrowly. We're defining it as high scores on tests, and
Right.
also we're defining it as doing those things that parents and kids themselves, guidance counselors, have come to believe are important to do to build a resume to get into college, especially to get into an elite college.
Yep.
So achievement is largely being defined as doing the things that you have come to believe are important to get into college.
Sure.
Even that is largely a myth. I know kids who've gone to fancy colleges who've done none of that, right? Those people are boring to the fancy colleges. Everybody's doing that. The people who get in that I know are the people who've developed real interests because they haven't been doing that. That's another alternative to it. One of the things that I find in my studies of self-directed learners, people who went to this school that I studied, many other schools modeled after it, people who were homeschooled by self-directed education, is that they're achieving very well in the real world because they had lots of time to figure out who they were, what their strengths are, what they like to do, what their passions are, and to become good at what their passions are, and then figure out a way to make a good living doing what their passions are. So in my research, I've published articles showing that roughly 50% of the people that I've studied who grew up with self-directed education are in careers that are direct extensions of passionate interests that they developed as children because they had lots of time to play and discover what they were interested in. And I could give many examples of that and have in my written work. So kids who are going through the typical process don't have time to do that. They're spending all their time doing what adults are telling them to do. They don't have time to learn who they are, to daydream, to think about, to philosophize. I think children are natural philosophers when they have the opportunity to do that, but we're not giving them time to do that. And they don't have time to play and explore, to develop hobbies, to develop the kinds of interests that people develop. And when I was in school years and years ago, even though we had school, we still had lots of time to do that kind of thing. And now kids don't have that time. And so real achievement is being replaced with this fake achievement of doing the things that some people believe you have to do to get into college, into a fancy college. And everybody believes you've got to go to a college. Many people believe that you're lost if you don't go to a fancy college. This is simply not true. I mean, there are research studies showing it's absolutely not true. If you control for background factors, if you control for the wealth of the family that you come from, there's no difference between whether you go to Harvard or whether you go to the local state university, even in terms of how much money you will make at age 40. There are studies showing this. But most people don't realize that. Of course, Harvard graduates make more, but they also come from families that make more, right? And so they've got a boost from the beginning. And so this belief that it's so important to get your child into one of the elite schools, and that is, there's a woman named Sonoya Luther, who actually died a few months ago, much younger than she should have, but she has been doing research, has been doing a lot of research on who are the children, who are the teenagers who are suffering the most psychologically. And at first she thought they would be kids from poor poverty families, and she began studying poverty families and the problems of poverty, and was looking at the rates of anxiety and depression and drug abuse and alcohol abuse and so on among them. And she was attributing this problem to poverty. And then the way she describes it is that somebody asked her, well, what's your control group? How do you know it's poverty? And so then she did the same study in Westchester County, the wealthiest county in New York State, and found the rates of anxiety, of depression, of binge drinking, of drug abuse was greater among them, among those teenagers, than among the kids from poverty that she'd been studying before. She then began to turn her attention to that, and she began to document the idea, that the evidence that the young people who seem to be suffering the most are the kids who are attending what she labeled as high achievement schools. These are the schools that most pride themselves in how high the test scores are and in what percentage of the graduates go on to Ivy League colleges and the like of Ivy League colleges. And in these schools, the kids are feeling pressure from everybody. They're feeling pressure not just from the teachers, and maybe even least from the teachers. They're feeling the pressure from the other kids because they're being compared to the other kids. They're feeling like they're failures if they don't make it into the honors classes or if they don't get all A's. And they're feeling pressure from their parents, who are high achievement people themselves and expect their children to be achieving at least as high as they did. And so those are the kids who are, I wrote a blog post a few years ago on pointing out that there are college kids who have breakdowns in the professor's office because they got a B on a course. Mm-hmm. They say, I can't get a B. Right. I've never gotten a B. As if this is the end of their life, that they got a B. So I wrote this into a blog post. It was part of a bigger blog post. And I got a lot of comments on that blog post from high school kids as well as college kids saying, yeah, I feel exactly that, and here's why. Yeah. I've been told all my life that I've got to get all A's. I've been told all my life that a B is a failure. I've been told that by my teachers. I've been told that by the guidance counselor. I've been told that by... Now, I don't think this is true for everybody, and maybe even they are exaggerating, but to the degree that there's some truth to that, this is awful. This is a ridiculous kind of a pressure. This is not achievement. This is a way of pressuring people to do things that are senseless. Mm. There's no point in trying to get an A in everything. There's nobody. What does it even mean to get an A? It used to be that you could say, I'm happy enough with a B or a C, and I want to spend my time doing the things that are meaningful to me, where I'm actually learning something because this is meaningful to me, rather than doing this thing just so that I can put it in my resume that I got all A's. Right.
So as a parent, a lot of that resonates with me, and then there's some other pieces that I think about, in terms of balance, right? So again, $2, 14, 16. I expressly chose, they go to public school, but there's reciprocity agreements, and the school that I have preferred, and since they were kindergartners, is not necessarily better in terms of teaching and learning. Certainly good teachers in that school, and then our home district school. But one of the things that they did not do from the get-go that was part of my driving motivation was they didn't emphasize state tests and scores, right? Like I remember my oldest daughter, who is in ballet and dancing, and so we'd carpool, and we were in the car with my daughter and then another dancer who goes to the homeschool, And we were talking about, what'd you do today? Oh, we had a test prep rally, a rally to, like get the kids excited for the standardized state test. And my daughter was like, wait, what? What are you talking about? Like, it made no sense to her. And so to me, that was a good thing, right? That's one of those reasons why it was important for us to choose that school. But then on the other hand, there are some metrics and things. My daughter is not likely to, and not really even doesn't seem interested in, applying to Ivy League schools and Harvard and things like that. We're in Kentucky. There's some good, fine state schools, and where she ends up is where she'll end up. Now she has some aspirations of they have a program, Governor's Scholar, and you have to have some certain metrics and scores, and so she's studying to get those ACT test scores up and those kinds of things. So I've told her, I don't look at the grades. They're pretty self-motivated. They're good kids. Are they? But she does compare scores with her friends, right? She does do that. And I think that some of that's certainly natural. And so how sort of balancing that, right? Because you don't want to say, well, you shouldn't aspire to those things. And I'm not saying you're saying that, right? Like, just go out and play and forget about anything academic. But finding that sweet spot and finding that balance, I think, is really hard. And sometimes, especially in the culture today, where she's saying, well, I don't have the test scores as my friends, and how do you explain to a 16-year-old? I mean, I do. It's like there are different ways of being smart, and there are other things that will show up later in life that may not show up on a math ACT score, and so on and so forth. But the reality is that to get scholarship money, to get into these programs and things, there are metrics that do matter, right? So finding that sweet spot and the balance, I think, is obviously part of the parenting game now. One thing that I wanted to add to that and to bring up, and maybe a bit of a devil's advocacy here, the idea that teachers create and have autonomy over what they teach and how they teach it, I think intuitively makes some sense, but also is perhaps problematic because you've got quality control concerns and that kind of thing. But maybe more importantly, and I'm assuming and guessing you are familiar with the work of somebody like E.D. Hirsch and that sort of shared knowledge idea that we as a society need that shared knowledge, and thus a sort of standard curriculum makes some sense. And some of that resonates with me. I think that it does make some sense that if we're lacking some of that shared language and knowledge and kinds of things, that it makes it harder for us to connect, and the connective tissue in our society deteriorates. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, well, there's a lot that you've just said, and the shared knowledge idea is, I understand it, and in some sense I'm sympathetic with it, with that idea. It is sort of nice to have a kind of a cultural, I mean, one of the functions of compulsory schools in the United States, one of the arguments for compulsory schooling back in the late 19th century, when they first began to be compulsory, we're a nation of immigrants, we're a nation of people coming from all over the world, and we want to make people Americans.
Right.
And so, civics is an important class.
Right.
Teaching people about the history of America. Interestingly, civics is one of the things that's kind of gone by the wayside, right? Because we're more concerned with how they're scoring on the math tests, which has nothing to do with the common sense of common ideas and so on. If that were what we were trying to do, we would have more civics and less math.
Yeah, and civics scores seem to have remained fairly stagnant, actually.
And civics, so that's but the other thing I want to say is this. So you can make all the decisions you want. We can make all the decisions we want about what children should learn in school. What they actually learn has little to do with those decisions. Because what they're actually doing in school is they're figuring out how to pass tests. They're learning the trick. Even the best students, if you question them, I'm learning what I have to learn to get the damn A. That's what I'm doing, and then I'm forgetting it. Every college professor knows that. I know from teaching, for example, at a relatively selective college. Boston College is not an Ivy League college, but relatively selective. I know from teaching statistics, I cannot assume that any of those students remember anything they learned in math. I just can't assume it. I can't assume they remember what it means to multiply one fraction by another. They might be able to do it, but they don't know what it means to do it. They don't know why you would do it. They don't understand the math. They've learned procedures, and even then they've largely forgotten the procedures. These are kids who got A's in their math classes, right, in high school, and they don't remember it. And when I talk to people in biology, oh no, I have to teach biology right from the beginning, even though supposedly they all took biology in high school. I have to teach it right from the beginning and first year biology. Every professor says that. Because we've decided it's in the curriculum doesn't mean that's what they're learning.
Right.
The fundamental problem is this. People are designed to learn what they're interested in. When you're interested in something, you absorb it. It's meaningful to you. It becomes part of you. You remember it. You think about it. It adds to your intellect. When you're doing something to get the reward of an A on a test, or praise from the teacher or a parent, or something like that, but you're not interested in it, you learn it in a shallow way that allows you to pass the test, but doesn't stay with you because it's not meaningful to you. Let me give you an example of this. So, a few years ago, I got interested in what educators call the summer slide. You've heard that phrase. So the summer slide is the supposed drop in academic understanding that occurs over the course of the summer. And so there are people who argue at that time, the reason I got interested in it is in Boston, there were, in Massachusetts generally, but there were some people who were seriously arguing that school ought to go through the summer, that we should cut out summer vacation. This was a vestige, they argued, of the agricultural era when kids were on farms and they needed the kids on the farm. So there's no reason we shouldn't have school through the summer. Well, of course, I was appalled by this. Bad enough that we have school the rest of the year, but school all year long, So I was invited into a radio debate, supposed debate with somebody on this. So I began to study, so the argument was about the summer slide. So one of the things that I'm good at is looking up research evidence. I'm author of an introductory psychology textbook, and I've spent a lot of my life looking up the research evidence for every idea in psychology to see which ideas ought to go in that book and not. So I hear people saying, kids lose a lot of what they learned over the course of the summer. And so the first question I ask, well, how do we know that? What's the evidence for that? Is this just rumor? Is this just what some teachers think? Have there actually been any studies? So I looked up, and there actually have been a few studies, and they've focused on two things. One is reading. Does reading ability drop during the course of the summer? The other is on math. Does math ability drop during the course of the summer? Every study I found showed reading increases over the course of summer. Reading ability increases at least as fast over the course of the summer as it does during the school year. Now, math is a more interesting story. So the way these studies are done, you test the children at the end of one academic year and at the beginning of the next academic year using the same test. It could be different batched versions of the same test. So when they tested with math, if you tested them in those studies where they tested them just for their memory of being able to do the calculations. Can you do long division? Doing long division, doing multiplying multi-digit numbers by one another. You do that. The kind of math nobody does anymore because we all do it on this, right? But that kind of math, if you test it and you test it in the school-like way, the way it's set up in school, there's a drop. People don't do as well, although they pick it up within the next 2 weeks, they're back where they were before, so it's not a big problem. But here's what's more interesting. I found two studies that not only tested math that way, but they tested for math reasoning ability. Not just can you do math, but can you understand math? Do you know when you would multiply? Do you know how to calculate how many gallons of paint you would need to, the kind of story problems, real world use of math, where you have to know why you would multiply or divide or add or when you would do it. You have to have some intellectual understanding of it. Both of those studies showed that math reasoning ability improved over the summer faster than it does during the school year. To me, that was not surprising. And the reason it wasn't surprising is because you really can't very well teach an understanding of math, at least, and most math teachers don't teach it. They teach procedures. They teach you how to do it. Kids memorize. And what you've memorized, if you don't really understand it, is easily forgotten. Our brains are not designed to hold on to trivia. We forget it. So we remember things that are really meaningful to us. So over the summer, kids, when they're out of school, they're doing things oftentimes that involve real numbers. Maybe they are painting their room, and they get a chance to they have to figure out how many gallons. They're cooking in the kitchen, or they're playing games, they're calculating baseball averages. They're doing things with real numbers, and that's where you develop an understanding of numbers. So in my studies of self-directed education, I find that the graduates are not at all afraid of math. They've been using numbers all their life. They feel they can learn whatever they need to know, and they're learning it in the context of the real world. One of the things that I like to do is, that because somehow math is for so many students the scariest thing in school, right? And that people are afraid of math. They all say, there's actually a book where this person who's done this study argues that math phobia is the biggest phobia in the country. But we're creating math phobia by the way we teach math in school. So, but the kids who aren't being taught math in school aren't afraid of math, and they don't have any difficulty figuring out the math they need. But one of the things I do, I know quite a few scientists, and I'll tend to ask scientists. So I'm sure you use math in your science, and tell me, do you ever use quadratic equations? Do you remember quadratic equations? And just like everybody else, I ask, oh yeah, I remember quadratic, but I don't really remember what they are, and I never use them. So, right? So basically every scientist I ask say, yeah, I use math, but it's math that I had to learn in relationship to the problems that I'm solving with math. It has nothing to do with the math that I learned in school. So the point I'm really trying to make is, we can sit back and say, well, there's all these things children ought to be learning in school, and let's make them learn it. Let's have courses in it. Let's test them in it. Let's not pass them unless they pass the test. Let's do all this. That has very little to do with whether they're actually really learning it.
Well, one of the more recent pieces I think you've published it was updated in September of 23, and I was reading it in preparation for this discussion. Originally published in 2017. It's titled Self-Directed Education, Unschooling and Democratic Schooling. And I'm reading that and then hearing you talk and some of the things that you just said. And I have been engaging with folks who are real advocates of direct and explicit instruction. Paul Kirshner was on the podcast. I think some of his work is interesting. Certainly some other folks. And one of the things, their heads are probably exploding if they're listening to you talk and, saying some of the things you're saying. One of the things they might say is, I can imagine a few things they might say, but one of the things they might say, well, yes, they're not remembering it for very long because the level of instruction is not good, right? So it's not, Rosenshine's 10 principles of instruction and long-term retrieval and all of these sort of science of learning kinds of principles. And, when I work with teachers, I sometimes think about it as a spectrum of sort of on one end, you've got sort of drill and kill, the most traditional kind of lecture, rote memorization kind of things. And then all the way on the other end, you might have something which is discovery learning. and closer to what you're talking about in this article. And in the middle, you've got lots of gradations of inquiry and pieces like that. And one of my frustrations is that they tend to conflate anything inquiry, anything not direct and explicit instruction, as discovery learning. And that's a straw man. That's a mischaracterization. I think about, we do lots of project-based learning work, and to me, one of the values of that is putting it in context, right? So you're learning it for a purpose and a reason to create something, and that leverages critical thinking and inquiry and all those pieces. But I think it's a valid criticism of project-based learning advocates sometimes, is that they go for sort of behavioral engagement, but not necessarily cognitive engagement, and that we do want to include direct and explicit instruction in project-based learning when appropriate, because you're trying to teach certain things, and that is an effective and efficient way to do that. So, I would imagine, I'm curious your reaction to that piece that I just talked about with our work, and the inclusion of those kinds of principles of instruction, but then also sort of that pushback and any other pushback, that, because I'm sure you've heard it, right? I'm sure you have had these discussions and had the people, pulling out their hair and saying, he's suggesting they don't have any real instruction.
Yeah, so I guess one way to think of it is, what is the proper goal of an education system? And I think the proper goal of an education system is that people grow up knowing who they are. The most important thing is knowing who you are, what you like to do, having an understanding of other people, how to get along well with other people, how to cooperate with other people, having compassion, having a sense that I have a duty to contribute to the world more than I take from the world. These are the things that I want people to have. This is, to me, a well-educated person is somebody like that. Somebody who feels confident that they can solve problems as they go through life, who feels confident that they can learn whatever they need to know when it comes time that they might need to know that. What I'm finding is that self-directed education seems to produce that kind of person. It doesn't matter whether they know quadratic equations. It doesn't matter whether they know what the capital of some other country is. It doesn't matter if it even doesn't matter if they know about the American Revolution and so on and so forth, because they can always find that out. The more important thing is that they are good people. They're compassionate, they're caring, and that they are confident people who say, if I want to know this, I can learn it. It's all there. I can learn it. It's easily, and today it's easier to get that information than it ever was before. Now, I'm not against direct instruction, but the time for direct instruction is when the student asks for it. So students in self-directed education often reach a point where they say, so I've been playing around with this and I'm really interested in this, and now I would really like to learn about this from the viewpoint of somebody who's a world expert in it, somebody who's really good at it. Now, we don't have a lot of those people teaching in high school, right? No, we don't. But there are those people. Some of them are online. You can hear every Harvard course if you want. You can go online and do it. And kids in self-directed education do that. Or they'll go to somebody who they know knows this. Every once in a while at the school that's called the Sudbury Valley School that I did my study at, every once in a while there will be a group of kids who say, we really, we're applying to fancy colleges next year, and we know we have to do the math SAT test, and we would like some instruction, direct instruction in the kind of math we would need to know. And they'll ask for that. And they'll be taught it by somebody who actually turns out to be an MIT graduate, and he's very good at explaining this in a way that is meaningful and they remember it. They can learn in the course of about, he says, in the course of 6 weeks, everything that they need to know to do well on that math SAT test. Now that's direct instruction. That might be ultimately for the wrong reason, except it's a good reason in the short run. They want to get into the college they want to go to, and they want to do well on that SAT test. But there are other people who ask for direct instruction on something that they're passionately interested in. So somebody's been fiddling around with the violin or the guitar or the piano, and they're enjoying it and they've learned quite a lot. But then they say, I would really like to learn from a master of this instrument, and then they'll sign up, they'll get a tutor, or if they can arrange to do that. And I think that same thing can occur in any realm. So it's not the matter of is direct instruction a good thing or a bad thing. It's a good thing if the person wants it. But otherwise, why do it? What does it matter? Why do we feel it's so important for everybody to know this thing if they're not interested in it? There's so many ways. We are such a diverse world at this point. There's so many different ways of making a living. There's so many ideas out there. There's no way anybody can know all of it. And so why make everybody learn the same little sliver of what's out there? Why not let people learn what they're interested in? Why not let the person who's really interested in art and music, or art or music, really spend their time on that? And the person who's interested in biology, spend their time on that. Why do we think we have to make everybody go through the motions of supposedly learning a little tiny sliver of something that they're not interested in, that they're not going to remember anyway?
Well, I'm mindful of time, and I don't want to keep you much longer. I can hear them saying in reply to that, well, there's lots of things that kids don't want to learn or don't like to learn, or that they're not interested in, or maybe don't even know that they're interested in. And so, we as adults have to, sometimes have them do, eat their vegetables, as it might be sort of said. And, certainly some of that I think is true, right? There's certainly things that kids don't know that they might be interested in until they get into it. There are certainly some things that they do need to understand and know that they may not necessarily like to do. I guess if I'm not saying that particularly elegantly, but feel free to respond to that kind of pushback, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this is a typical way that we justify what we're doing. But if you talk to kids, and if you see kids, as I have as a college professor, have come out, what we're doing when we make them learn something that they're not interested in is we're teaching them to dislike it. We're teaching them that this is labor. This is not something fun. I hate this. And that's what is happening over and over. I've had conversations like this when I was teaching in psychology, and I would talk to somebody who's a new psychology major, and I'd say, so why are you majoring in psychology? And they'd say, well, so I took a course in biology in high school, and I learned I really hate biology. And I took a course in math, and I learned I really hate math. And I took a course in history, and I learned I really hate history. But I never took a course in psychology. So maybe I'll like psychology. I've actually heard students say that. And I think that there are many other students who would say that if they were to be honest about it. I think that when we force people to do something that they don't want to do, and we force them through a method of reward and punishment, through shaming if they don't do well, through making them feel bad about, that's our method of coercing them through, is comparing them to other students, and how are you, and that's not how you develop a love of something, right? Yeah. That's not how you develop an interest in something. Yeah. And in this world, I don't think we have to worry about exposing people to ideas. If anything, people are exposed to too many ideas. We're exposed to stuff all the time. I can't imagine that there's somebody who isn't aware that there's such a thing as biology and that there's some interesting things in biology, or who isn't aware that there's such a thing as history, or there's such a thing as wars, and there's such a thing, and everybody's aware of these things. The idea that somebody's going to grow up unaware of these things is foolish.
Okay. Well, like I said, I'm mindful of time, and I won't keep you any longer. I will definitely refer folks to your website, which is petergray.org, and there you can find some of the things that you've written in your books and the article that I mentioned, which is certainly worth a look, Self-Directed Education, Unschooling, and Democratic Schooling. Anything else that you think you want to get off your chest before we jump off, and or links, the places that folks might need to find you?
No, I think my website is, for people who are interested in any of my academic articles. You can find PDFs of many of them there. There are some of my talks are available there on YouTube. For people who are interested, I'm doing a Substack called Play Makes Us Human, in which I've got a series of articles, a series of essays about the ways that play in adulthood as well as children's play humanize us. That I make the argument that part of our evolutionary history, how we split off from the other apes, had to do with our extended playfulness, which made culture possible, which contributed in many ways to the way we are human beings. And so part of my message is to get back to being fully human. We need to cultivate more of the playful aspects of ourselves.
Right. And folks can find that at, I'm trying to look it up here quickly because I did see that, but I don't remember the name of it. You said Play Makes Us Human. So you can find it at petergray.substack.com is where you can find that, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. So.
Okay.
Well, Peter, it's been a pleasure. I'm glad I finally got to connect with you. Lenore and I have talked, several times, and she refers to you, like I said, glowingly in most cases, or in all cases. No cases that she hasn't been glowing. And as I always say, I hope the conversation for folks listening was helpful.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be on.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.